Yeah, hello, yes, my name's Mike Middleton. I work in the Heritage Environment, the Heritage Information team for Historic Environment Scotland here in Edinburgh. And I'd like to talk to you today about some work I've been doing analysing the Atlas of Hillforts of Britain and Ireland. Now, to provide a little bit of context, the Atlas was published online in 2017. It was created by a team of 12 people, headed by Professors Gary Locke and Ian Ralston. They identified 4,147 hill forts and collected 244 columns of information against each fort. The hard copy Atlas was published in 2022. And what was really exciting as far as I was concerned was that the data was made available as open data, which meant any of us could have a look at it and download it and interrogate it. I first interacted with the Atlas through the website. You can go onto the website and, it's point data. You can click on the points, get the information you want that way. I soon graduated to using the REST service, which allowed me to download the data into my GIS software so that I could analyze it that way. And because it's point data, I eventually ended up just exporting it as a CSV file for use in my later analysis, which I'll come to in a minute. Now, I found this data really exciting. It's unusual to get such a large, well-structured data set, archaeological data set like this. And obviously, I work in Scotland. There's a lot of hill forts in Scotland, and I was excited to see what sort of insights there might be in this data. When I started looking at it, this was back before the hard copy publication had come out, and I found the online supporting documentation a little bit limited in terms of giving me the sort of detail I wanted to know in terms of what the various categories of information were. So I thought I'd better take a look at that data myself to try and answer some of these questions from some of these questions I had. In terms of doing this work, I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I might as well make it as available as I can to others so that they can use it. So I searched around for some various tools that I might use. I eventually fell upon Google Colab, Google Collaboratory, which is free if you've got a Google account, and anybody can access it. So great. Effectively, this is a coding environment where you can create code that when you run it, it appears in line in a notebook format, and then you have text blocks that you can use to add commentary and descriptions. Now, it's quite hard to demonstrate what one of these looks like, so I thought I'd just make a little video of me scrolling through one just to give you an idea. Hopefully that will work. Yeah. So yeah, the way I tend to work, I tend to have most of my code at the top of my notebooks, and then all the analysis and descriptions and commentary come after that. So if you do go and look at them, please push past the code at the beginning. The interesting stuff's at the bottom. As a result of this, I've ended up down a rabbit hole and ended up producing 6 of these notebooks, which have resulted in 546 figures and 14 reprocessed data packages. Now, being live documents, you can interact with them. I've got a little section at the beginning where you can choose to download the images or the reprocessed data onto your computer if you so wish. If you'd rather have a topographic background rather than an outline, you can do that too. If you don't want to do that and you just want a PDF, or if you just want to download a specific image, it's all there in my GitHub account. Please knock yourself out, go and have a look, take what you want. It's all open data. Ultimately, I'm working towards a publication for this. And I will be archiving elements of this in a more secure long-term archaeological repository. I just haven't got there yet, but I'm pretty sure the GitHub will remain no matter what. Now, I was interested, I say, in having a look at this data. One of the things I would like to do is use it with machine learning tools in due course. But before doing that, you have to have a good look at the data and you have to restructure it to now allow yourself to do that. So there's a number of tasks that I've gone through in these documents. Machine learning doesn't like empty values, no values, so you've got to do something about them. You've got to impute them. I've gone through the replace with recognizable substitutes route. The archaeological data can be messy. There are different data types you can find in different fields, so they have to be split into their data types. You have to identify the different data types themselves, because you can only really use numeric data with machine learning tools. So if you've got numeric data, great, that can be easily scaled or the like. If you've got text fields, you have to identify whether they're categorical. So things like word lists and thesauri, they're relatively easy to turn into numeric data. You can use things like one-hot encoding and the like, whatever. But if you've got free text fields, then you have to sort of decide what you're going to do. You know, there's you can either just ignore them completely, or you can look at strategies to do data mining within them to sort of pull out structured data. At the minute, I've just gone down the route of actually identifying them. And then there's the dimensions of the data. As I say, there's 244 categories or columns of data associated with these Hillforts. If you're in a machine learning model, it will take all of that data and it will try and look through it all to find clusters. The more data you have, the harder and the more diffuse those clusters are to find. So in this little example on screen, we've got 2 data points in 2 dimensions. They're relatively close together. You know, we add just 1 dimension, you can see how those 2 data points become stretched apart. If you imagine we now add 244 dimensions, they become really far apart. And then if we encode it, they get even more dimensions. It becomes even further apart still. It becomes really diffuse. It becomes really hard to spot clusters. So one of the ways to look at reducing clusters is to sort of, as I say, have a good look at the data itself. So here you can see on the top left, we've got things like a table of data. We've got England as a main country. We've got England as a code. That's the same information in 2 columns. We can lose one of them. Great, that's a column of information gone. That's 1 dimension lost. And there's lots of duplication in the Atlas. There's things like multiple projections, multiple coordinate systems. Then we've got things like unique identifiers. They're great for linking data between different data sources, but in terms of machine learning, they're not really telling us much about the sort of Hillforts themselves. So they might be columns of information we might want to get rid of to try and reduce data dimensions as well. And then the data itself, you know, you might have columns of information where there's very small values, or a column like this one where outcrop, not a single Hillfort was identified as being on an outcrop. There's no information gained there. Bang, we can get rid of it. Another thing to look at, as I say, in going through data like this, is to look at the various bias in the data. People like Dave Cowley and Strat Halliday have done some good papers that are worth looking at if you're interested in patterning of archaeological data. So, you know, archaeological data is full of bias, and 2 examples here in the northeast, here in southern Scotland, you can see there's a real you know, density of, for instance, crop mark sites that have ended up in the Atlas. So these, we've had this intensive flying program in Scotland since the mid-1970s, and this has created, you know, a large number of crop mark sites that are fed through into the Atlas. And this level of flying and has not been carried out necessarily across the rest of the country, which means that there's a sort of a boosting effect of any clusters that we might see in this area. On the other side there, on the terminology, we've got different terminologies used in different parts of the country, and this sort of highlights where there's potential sort of work still to be done, you know, in terms of harmonizing language across the Atlas. And then we've got things like this, where we've got a cluster right over the south, over Wessex, for instance. This is an image of forts dated 400 BC to AD 50. I'd argue this is a false cluster in this situation, because what it's showing us is not that there's a concentration of forts of that period in this area. It's just showing us that there's actually been just a lot of excavation in this area. And you know, it's not really telling us so much about forts. It's really telling us we need to do more excavation outside of that area. So it's really important to go through these various attributes. Now, the main work of that I've been carrying out has been to look at, as I say, look at each attribute, plot its distribution. These will duplicate a lot of what you will find in the Hillforts Atlas itself. What I've added to these is density. So for instance, here you can see a density just of the Hillforts plotted against their location. And we can see what we saw earlier there. You can see this very intense cluster in the northeast. You can see another big cluster in the south, and we can see how this one in the northeast is really boosted. It's been boosted by all these crop marks. It's really exaggerated compared to the rest of the atlas. So what I've done then is use statistical tools to try and sort of investigate a little bit further within the data. So here, for instance, we have a box plot. You can see the central box plot, the red one there, shows 50% of the data. And when a box plot is split between clusters like this, or stretched like that, it does tend to hint that there is maybe more than one cluster within the data. So we can use that. So we can use, say, for instance, a histogram of the data to identify the low points in that between those things. So we can split the data into two data packages, and we see the box plots now are much more aligned with the clusters they're on. And the northern one there, you can see it's still stretched. So we can do the same thing again. We can find another cluster along the northwest of Scotland, and we can use the Irish Sea to separate off Ireland to do and continue that process over there. Now, I must say the density of Hillfort distribution across the atlas is not uniform. In Ireland, for instance, there are far less Hillforts than the rest of the atlas. And if you read Ian Ralston on this, he talks about how they excluded 60,000 ringforts, raths and cashels in Ireland just because of the sheer volume of them. It just wasn't going to be possible to process that amount of data and deliver the project on time. And what this results in is that there are forts, for instance, in the northwest of Scotland that are in the atlas that are not in the atlas in Ireland. Their equivalents are not there in the atlas in Ireland. So what I would argue is that, again, it's another bias in the data. There's a selection bias to what's gone into the atlas. It's not a bad thing. It's just the way it is. But it does mean that there's not necessarily a uniformity of selection across the atlas. But I would argue that within the actual sort of regional groupings here, the data is relatively consistent. So if you get these regional groups. So we end up with a distribution that looks like this, which sort of highlights these sort of clusters a little bit more compared to where we started, these original data packages. Now, I'm going to show you a second example here. This is area, so this is Hillfort area. And Hillfort area is interesting because it's one of those that's been used for a long time in terms of classifying Hillforts. In 1962, the Ordnance Survey published their map of the Iron Age of southern Britain, and at that point they created a tripartite classification system based on area. And Albert Rivet, the lead on that project, talked about how that system was developed through a system of trial and error. In 1975, that system was extended by Alexander Hogg to a five class system where they added classes on either end. And the system's been used right up to, Dennis Harding last used it in 2012. The Hillforts Atlas itself developed a classification, has developed its own classification system, a 5-group classification based on area, which is a mix of statistical analysis and reference to these earlier classification systems. What I'd say I've done differently is I've tried to get the data lead on creating sort of classes. So for instance, here are these 3 images at the top. The central one is the central 50% of that data. So this is what you call the interquartile range, I say. And the data on the left, the tiny forts, these are the lower quartile, and the data on the right is the upper quartile. And there's actually a 4th class, which is not visualized here, which is extremely large forts over 10 hectares. And these are the very, very top 2.2% of the data, the outliers, effectively. And they form a subset of that southern group. Now, we already saw earlier on how we could identify these 5 regional groups. So we can look at area in terms of those. We can see the Those in the northwest are very much smaller than those in the south. But we can also look at those, so for instance, in the south there, compared to the image at the top, where we're just looking at the data exclusively for area itself. And we can see there's obviously a clear difference between the south, between Wales and those hill forts in Wessex. We can see that there's these relatively small forts in Wales and these larger forts in Wessex. So it's helping us, again, sort of give us a more nuanced view on what we're looking at. Now, I've continued this process right through the Atlas, right through all the 244 attributes to create what one of my colleagues calls the giant flip book of distribution clusters, Hillfort clusters. And yes, that's effectively what it is. It's lots and lots and lots of pictures of clusters, helping us identify the bias, helping us identify what's significant in different places. But what I hope I've created is the sort of foundation for creating a sort of a data-driven classification in terms of how we start talking about hill forts. In this example here, for instance, in the northwest, you can see how we can use these clusters how we can use these clusters sort of to group them to find what is the sort of average fort in an area. And classification, it's fundamental to archaeology. It's how we frame our discussions. It's how we identify what's normal in one area and what's unusual. So yeah, I hope that's really what this adds to the fantastic work that the original Hillforts team did in creating the Atlas. And that is me. I hope you found that interesting. Thank you very much.